Hello, creative people. Thanks for tuning in to Melody or Witchcraft. I'm your host, Catherine Petrocelli. On the podcast, we hear a poet read a work of their own and an Emily Dickinson poem of their choosing that contributed to their work. We discuss poetry, Dickinson, the fluidity of time, and the scope and sources of creative inspiration. The past is such a curious creature, Dickinson wrote. Join us to find out how it can teach us about our now.
How dreary to be sad.
Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me.
That was Nuala O'Connor reading Emily Dickinson. Nuala O'Connor lives in Galway, Ireland. Her fifth poetry collection, Menagerie from Arlen House, was published in 2025. Her novel Miss Emily, about Emily Dickinson's friendship with an Irish maid, was published in 2015 by Penguin USA and Sandstone in the UK. She's currently writing a memoir about late diagnosed autism. She's a member of Us Donna. Welcome. Hi, Nuala. Great to see you again.
Hi, Kitty. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I first just wanted to thank you for choosing that poem because it is such a familiar one, such a popular one, not even just within the fans of Dickinson or within poetry fans, but folks outside of the realms of poetry know that poem, or at least its opening line, right? Hope is the thing with feathers. And because it is so popular, it's become a bit invisible. At least I'll speak for myself here. I can't remember the last time I read the poem in full until you suggested it for the podcast. So for that, I thank you. I was noticing as well, just to dive right into one of the topics that I really want to chew on here about time, context of our time really influences, of course, how we read something. And when I was reading this poem this time, that second verse, that storm, so we have established, of course, the little bird with its feathers singing, and sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. So I feel like in the times we're living in, that storm can become something quite sinister if we let it. And it can obviously be many different things. I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about context, about reading things at different times, even in your personal life, and how they resonate differently.
Yeah, I think, thank God, most of us grow up eventually. And with maturity definitely comes insight and wisdom that we didn't have. And I've been an Emily Dickinson fan really since I was in third class in school, so around the age of 8 or 9. I had a fantastic, creative, flexible-minded teacher, and she brought us Emily Dickinson. I think one of the first poems I ever learned of Dickinson's was A Bird Came Down the Walk. And I used to act it out for my sisters. We were that kind of family. We did, we put on plays at home and stuff. And so I can think back to a childhood enjoying Dickinson, and then moving into my teenage years, I did Dickinson specifically for my Leaving Cert, which is the final year exams for 17, 18-year-olds in Ireland. And so she's kept me company for a long time, probably 45, 46 years. And reading her now is different to reading her then. And then because I wrote a novel about Dickinson that was published 10 years ago, so the research would have been the previous 3 years to that, say. I was reading her much more intentionally, intentfully, if that's a word, with much more rigor, I suppose, and reading a lot around her. And so you read the poems differently. But I would feel she's been a lifelong companion. She's one of those writers. I think in our lives, maybe we only have a handful of them, but she's one of mine. And like when you read her poems and they have ostensibly a simplicity, but it's a really complex simplicity, as we know, because it's well crafted, well constructed, well thought through, well thought out. They're timeless. And as you say, in this very strange 2025 we're in with wars and the upending of society, this poem speaks brilliantly. And hope is something I'm obsessed with it, I think, because for so long I felt so hopeless. I was undiagnosed as an autistic person until 3 years ago, and so I spent a lot of time in and out of jags of depression. My anxiety is constant, even though I take medications to assuage it a bit, it's still there. But to be in and out of depressions and to fall into that really hopeless pit is really something to contend with as a human being. The year before my Emily Dickinson novel was published, I had the word hope tattooed on my arm, really as a homage to Emily, but also as a way to anchor myself to hope, because there were times when I felt that hope wasn't a real thing. It just couldn't possibly exist. And so this autism memoir I'm writing is actually called The Hope Cure, because with my diagnosis, I have found hope. In a way, I want to write that book to reassure other people that if you can suddenly understand yourself, there is hope. Hope returns. And I didn't believe it ever could or would. But here I am in my mid-50s and it's back and it just feels so good. And so this poem, I know it's a bit of a cliche. And as you say, it gains that kind of invisible status because it's so like, oh, everybody knows it. But when you go back to it and read it again, it's a lifeline to me, this poem. And I remember going to the Houghton Library in Harvard when I was doing my research for the novel and seeing the 1861 handwritten manuscript of this, and like just nearly falling out of my standing with absolute reverence and joy at seeing Emily's actual piece of paper with Emily's actual ink on it and her words. It's a life highlight.
Yeah, I can feel the emotion in myself just in this moment hearing you recount that and thinking of that myself, just seeing her own hand at the page there. And I think you're pointing to a couple of things that I feel exist. And of course, we're only speculating, we're always speculating, but for her as well, potentially in this poem, which is both the personal and the political. And of course, those marry on and on in our poetry. If we're to believe Thomas Johnson, and some don't, in his collected works of hers, because some of his dates that he speculates on the appearance of some of her work have been challenged by later editions, but he puts this poem at about 1861. 1861 makes me think of that personal and that political. So we have, of course, the American Civil War beginning in April of that year. And then based on one of Dickinson's letters where she refers to the terror that she's had since September, that would have been September of 1861 that she's referring to. Of course, we never get really to the bottom exactly of what that terror might have been, though, again, much speculation around it. But this marrying the political, the personal for her, and it sounds like it's reflected in your own reading and your own embracing of this particular poem.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I like the warmth and the positivity in this poem. Like they really speak to my gut. And when I read it, I always pause on the inverted commas around hope. And I wonder, I stop, I interrogate that. I wonder why Emily felt the need for those inverted commas. And I think
Yes, so for the American listeners, those are quotation marks.
Oh yeah, sorry, the double quotation mark. And I
Yes,
have to,
yes. So the first word of the poem, yes, hope is quoted.
yeah, and I
It is
always
interesting.
try, when I teach creative writing, I always try and encourage students to go slowly through the work and always pause at the title. Of course, Emily doesn't have titles, though we give them the title, the first line. And to stop and interrogate and slow down and then meander through the rest of the poem. She has hope as an unstoppable natural thing, and it's so undemanding in her secluded world. And she was a fan of Emily Bronte, who wrote No Coward Soul Is Mine, and that's the poem that she had read at her funeral. It's a different take on hope. Hope in Bronte's poem stretched her wings and soared to heaven. Dickinson's take is more life-affirming. It's kind of a counterpoint to Bronte's more downbeat verses on the same theme. But yeah, I mean, I think my love for Dickinson as a teenager was very much based on my own melancholic little heart. I was a goth, so I wore all black and I was into dark and deep things. And a lot of the poems that Emily is famous for is for these darker ones. I felt a funeral in my brain and so on. But I've kind of seen both sides of her, even as a child, and then later, of course, you see all of the wonderful breadth of all of the poems that she actually did write.
And her incredible sense of humor, which
Yeah.
is for some folks that are looking for an introduction to Dickinson, I sometimes point them first to the letters, because you can find her humor, of course, in the poems, but the letters can be just so witty and so slaying.
I actually think that's really relevant because people have one idea of her. And when I was researching the novel, you know, her voice in her letters is so fresh, it's so wry, it's so funny, it's so jokey, it's slightly cruel. You know, she's not this angsty, obsessed with death, downbeat recluse of our kind of imagination or of people's imagination. And, you know, she could also be very cryptic, very wordy, very odd in a way, and intense. So for the voice of the novel, because it's two first person narratives, one of them is Emily's voice, I had to kind of tone down the cryptic. But at least I had the humor to work with that I found in the letters. And that was really good. I tried to make the spirit of Emily come alive in the pages.
Yes. Well, your research in that book is impeccable as well, I will say, of course, as someone who is drawn to writing historical figures.
I mean, for me, taking on an American icon to write a novel about was a little bit scary. But you know, you kind of feel scared for about 10 minutes. You get into the research and you're in there and you're fine. And the audaciousness of the project loses its weight until you have to face the Dickinson scholars later. You know? And they're criticizing everything that you do. But, you know, that's par for the course when you write about historic figures.
Well, I would love it if you would read for us your poem that you brought.
Yeah, so this poem really, it's quite a simple poem. There's a nod to Dickinson in the two end rhymes and the verses, but this really is more about the reason I wrote the novel. Apart from being an ultra fan of Emily, I had heard that she liked to bake, or had read that she liked to bake, and I like to bake. So I started looking up her recipes, and I began to bake her cakes, her gingerbread, her coconut cake. I even made the black cake, the famous 19 egg kind of Caribbean. It's more like what we would call a Christmas pudding here, a very
Yeah,
heavy,
very
fruity.
heavy.
So I made them, and you know, just started thinking about the fact that she baked and was in the kitchen with the maids. And I thought, wow, this is possibly the stuff of fiction. So I did something that I often do. I wrote something. And what came first was a poem. And this is it. It's simply called Miss Emily Dickinson's Coconut Cake. She blends Virgin Island coconut with butter and sugar. Sieves flour, 2 cups. Beats eggs with the milk of an Amherst cow. Adds cream of tartar to make everything bloom. In her white wrapper, she stands at the window, lowers a basket of cake to the children below. Love's oven is warm, Miss Dickinson says, watching them eat from her spinster's room.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you really build out the scene with story and fact and Dickinson's own words. Love's oven is warm as well. And it's really lovely.
Thank you.
It brings us right to that space. My mind immediately goes to that window, the window that she supposedly lowered cake down to the children of the neighborhood from. And so we kind of get to time travel in that way, imagistically, with the idea of time and with the idea of broadening even beyond Dickinson a bit. I'm curious about how we evaluate figures of the past for modern audiences. Even in, you know, you called this poem simple. I don't know if I would call it simple, but we've got, just even in the baking, the Virgin Island coconut, which leads us to understand, one, her privilege and her family's ties with the slave economy as well. I mean, we can really kind of dive into the time even through those ingredients. What are your main guidelines for yourself when you are presenting a figure of the past to modern audiences? What are you keeping? Are you assessing in some way, editing some of these pieces that might be, if we judge them right now, a different outcome?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very wedded to the facts and the truth in these historical fictions that I write. I want to represent things as they were. Obviously, I'm a fiction writer, so I also have to invent. But I don't want to change the personality or the actions of the people I write about. The unfortunate thing is sometimes that publishers run shy of stuff that is very difficult. Publishers are in the business of selling and they will create these sort of categories. There's an act of violence in my book that they were a bit scared about, so I wrote it in such a way that you don't see the actual violence. It's written very much from above, if you like. I've written another novel that was set on a plantation in Carolina. Not the editors that published it, okay? So the book is published, but the editors that decided not to publish it ran scared of me, a white middle-aged Irish woman, writing about Black enslaved people on, plantation. And so it did get published, but I had to tone down a lot of the violence that I had read about. I'd done very careful research. I had done a course on the enslaved, etc., etc. I had done very careful research, and I wanted to put in the facts of what happened to people because they are so ugly and so damning. But publishers don't want that a lot of the time in a novel that's directed at a certain audience. So you as the writer may want to depict difficulties, but the publisher may run scared of that because they feel it's not palatable to whomever. So it's not always what you write that gets published as well.
That is fascinating. Yeah, thinking about the publisher as gatekeeper, which of course they are, and sieve here in between the writer and the audience.
My original ending to Miss Emily was very, very bleak. And the publisher said, no way, no, 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 no. Can't have it so bad. You need to find a way to make this more hopeful. So I actually used Hope is the Thing with Feathers as a framework to make a more hopeful ending. It's an ambiguous ending, you really don't know, but it's less downbeat than what I originally had, So yeah, there is a lot of sort of comment made to you about certain things as a writer, and then it's comment, but it's also would I use the word control? I mean, I wasn't given a choice, really. I wasn't allowed to keep my unhappy ending.
And did you see the unhappy ending as more honest?
Yes, I did, yeah. More true to life. Obviously, a certain amount of invention has to take place. I'm a novelist, that's my job. But I also want to reflect life as it is. Like Dickinson was a maverick woman. I love to write about maverick women. But there are consequences that come with being a maverick woman.
I think it's worth bringing out in this particular conversation the fact that that maverick woman of the 19th century did not publish, not as we know it.
Yeah, yeah. So while she was tapping away at the glass ceiling, she couldn't get through or didn't want to get through because of her reclusive nature, etc. Though clearly she was sending out some stuff and asking questions of Higginson and so on. So the desire may have been there, but also there could have been the fear of being exposed as such, or being perceived maybe as well.
Or her work being changed, which she maybe would not have tolerated, as we do have one example of at least as well. Her snake poem, which I will put in the show notes. And I will put her quote about how it was taken and published and changed and her reaction to that in the show notes as well.
I think a lot of readers don't realize what it's actually like to write, edit, and publish a book, that it's not this straightforward, you write it and it goes out there. There are a lot of steps along the way that can change it and maybe move it in a direction you weren't planning on, sometimes for the good and sometimes not.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to touch briefly on Dickinson's likely neurodiversity, and you mentioned your own, and kind of think about the other direction of what I had asked previously. I was asking about bringing folks of the past to modern audiences. What is your take on taking modern frameworks or labels, etc., and applying them to lives of the past? How far is it appropriate to go with that? For myself, I can say I very much appreciate and lean into what I see as evidence of Dickinson's neurodiversity, and I take refuge in that. But what do we get to call it? How far do we get to go down that road?
For me, I'm not a psychologist, so I can't diagnose her, and she's not sitting in any psychologist's room to be diagnosed. But I think we can look at the collection of things that she struggled with and we can sort of see that there was something going on there. I think it's okay to do that, to look backwards and just sort of maybe understand what wasn't understood then. And in a sense, forgive people for the way they carried on. You know what I mean? Like, I don't feel any need to forgive Emily for anything, but some people, like she stopped going to church, which must have been huge for her family and for herself. For the people of the village, they must have thought she was extremely odd. But I mean, Austin, her brother, was very odd too. They really were people who did things their own way. And often that's how the neurodivergent brain operates. It operates in a way that doesn't fit within the confines of so-called societal norms. It wants to do its own thing. And it takes a very courageous person to push against. And I think Emily was extremely courageous. She knew her freedom lay in writing. There's that beautiful testimony from her niece, Martha, who said she was in Emily's bedroom with her and she turned an imaginary key and said freedom. And the idea of being locked in as freedom is anathema to most neurotypical people, but any neurodivergent person you talk to would go, yay, I'm locked in, I can do what I want. Like
That's right.
a lot of neurodivergent people didn't mind the lockdowns during COVID, etc. So it's different ways of being in the world. The problem is that people see those of us who like to be sequestered and alone as untoward, whereas we're just different. It's just a different way of being. I don't love crowds. Emily didn't love crowds. I think I really identified with her and still do. I love that she had the courage to wear clothes that were not the clothes of a woman of her status. She wore her white loose wrapper, which is really like a maid's outfit, much to her mother's consternation. She hung around the kitchen with the maids. She really was just doing her own thing. She was that kid from Sesame Street.
Is there anything that writers like yourself, in terms of historical novelists, that you feel like you have in common? What is there a common denominator for folks that gravitate to these voices of the past or these places of the past?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's about stopping the smudging of women who I see have been downgraded by history and were downgraded at the time they lived. I want to bring them fully into the limelight and let them strut their stuff on the stage that I've created for them. The past is such a huge component of my writing life. I want these women to have their say, to share their side of the story, not to be looked at through a male lens, but through a female lens. And I bring obviously all of my own obsessions and biases to my writing table. I bring my feminism, I bring myself as a mother, I bring my empathy, sensitivity. Those are all the things that I'm bringing. And I'm just trying to figure out, what did it feel like to be a woman who didn't want to be, inverted commas, normal in a restrictive society like 19th century, middle century America, just after the Civil War, etc., etc. Yeah, so I am pretty much obsessed with how these women got on, how they moved through the world, what were the obstacles they faced, I suppose. I'm sort of saturated in this business of writing about the past. Even the contemporary novel I have coming out in spring 27 is about memory and how it souses our present and what it does to us. And one of the characters in the novel is actually a scholar who looks at memory. I love to use my research and try and use it lightly. I might fail sometimes, but also to create a living, breathing person of these people.
And when you're not working specifically with a historical figure, when you're, say, writing a poem of your own, are there voices, or who are those voices that are coming through, maybe less obviously, through the pen? Who are some of your other literary ancestors as you see them beyond Dickinson?
Oh, yeah. So I would have grown up on a diet of E. Nesbitt and Noel Streatfeild and Walter Mackin and people like that. Later, I suppose, the Brontes and Jane Austen, Kate Chopin. My reading life and reading pleasure would be barren without all of these women who were pushing against, again, the publishing world. A lot of them had to publish under pseudonyms, etc., etc. So they literally made my path for me. There's a great quote from Elaine Sisou who talks about woman must write herself, must write about women and bring women to writing. And she says they've been driven away as violently as from their bodies. Woman must put herself into the text. But without all of these, the Charlottes, the Emilys, the Janes, the Mariah Edgeworths, and so on, I wouldn't exist because they paved my path. And also the more contemporary people, the women who are a few years older than me in Ireland, like Anne Enright, Mary Morrissey, Eilish Ní Gaibhne, Paula Meehan, American writers like Sharon Olds, they're all doing the stuff. I could see them doing the stuff that I wanted to be doing. And so I emulated them and read them voraciously and tried to understand what they were doing and figured out what was allowed from them. What are you allowed to write about? Because when you grow up on a diet of, male, pale, and stale, which a lot of the stuff we're taught in school is, it's so refreshing to pick up a book by a woman like Mary Morrissey when you're in your 20s and want to be a writer. And she's writing about a girl getting her period on a train. And you're like, oh, okay, we are allowed to write about this stuff. Cool,
So in terms of subject matter, you would go for it with this kind of permission from these other writers. And in terms of style, is the first step for you, or was it for you as a young woman, mimicry?
No, I don't think it was mimicry. And I think I kind of resisted the idea of influence for a long time, which seems quite silly now. I think it's that language was so important to me. And I think that is a feature of autistic girls, especially. We tend to be hyperlexic. We're early readers. I started reading at the age of 3, encouraged by my mother. We tend to like words. We hoard words. And then I was brought up bilingual as well. So all of my education was through the Irish language, through Gaelic, as Americans might know it. So I went to Gaelic medium schools, which means every subject is taught through the Irish language. So language at home was English, and in school was Irish. And then I went on to do a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Arts in the Irish language as well. So in translation, actually, my master's. So I've always had this sort of living between the two languages and just love the way there's certain things you can say in Irish that you can't say in English, etc. There's better words in Irish for certain things. So I've always just been so interested in language, but also in precision and concision and small things. I'm so fascinated with smallness as a concept in writing and in other things like little trinkets and things that I collect. I would call myself a languagey writer. I'm interested in language first and foremost. I'm not hugely, as a novelist, interested in plot, even though plot just happens. It's just what characters are doing and if they get out of it or not. So it's kind of a simple thing that's been overcomplicated, in my opinion. But I write about the things, like all of us who write, that I'm possessed by. And for me, that's the body moving through the world in a female body. Ireland has changed hugely since I was born in 1970. We've had a very rapid sort of, almost like a rapid teenage experience in Ireland, where Ireland just went sort of crazy for a few years. And we're very under the influence of other Anglophone cultures like American culture and English culture. And I would have been saturated in all of that in my childhood and in my teens and my 20s, but also in Irish culture as well. So I think there's just been a lot of sort of great ingredients that I've had access to. And honestly, that's thanks to my parents who grew up in poverty, left school. Basically, my mother left school at 12, which was very normal because free education only came into Ireland in the 60s. So I benefited from free education, and my parents made sure we went to good schools because they didn't get a proper education. They were very determined that the 7 of us, their children, got a proper education. And so I've them to thank for getting me the access to the worlds of words and literature and all of that good stuff that they had to learn on their own. They were very cultured, but they learned it on their own.
Well, Nuala, thank you so much. It's been really great to talk about everything from the Irish language to publication. I just am so glad you could be here.
Thanks so much, Kitty. It's always lovely to talk to you.
Thanks for being with us today for Melody or Witchcraft. You can find out more about today's guest by going to nualaoconnor.com. That's nualaoconnor.com. Our theme music is by Emma Wallace. The podcast is available on all the usual platforms. For more information, join the Ask the Poet Substack, where you can also find the show notes from today's show. Please comment, like, restack, recommend. We'd love to hear from you.